Grapes are the worst fruit you could ever eat. Fruit has been sold to us as healthy and nourishing, even by people who used to be carnivore. But the opposite is true.
Fruit is clearly beneficial for the human body. It's very hard to make an argument that fruit is harmful.
Last night, my husband and I left work and went to the sauna. My blood sugar leaving the sauna was 78. On the way home, we stopped by the grocery store and grabbed some ribs. And he picked up a healthy snack. Guess what? Whole food, unprocessed, healthy snack shot my blood sugar up to 225. Grapes. The worst part is, I know that for every minute my blood sugar is that high, my brain is making a few tau proteins, the mechanism behind dementia. On top of that, I know that the excess glucose in my circulation will be converted to fructose, which is preparing my body for winter and to store fat. Fruit is evil.
The intensity of her delivery, I watched it a few times. Every single time, I'm just a little bit shaken. Anyways, Mike, so taking Dr. Boz's advice, it would be best to, go to the sauna and then, go straight into your keto snacks, correct? Just for health, longevity, feeling good, feeling great.
Yeah, this is, I think, well, she shots fired at Paul, she threw some shade there at Paul with, previous carnivore influencers saying that fruit is healthy. I think that Dr. Boz's take here is less of an indication that fruit is evil, and it's more of an indication that Dr. Boz is insulin resistant. And now, whether that's a pathological insulin resistance or a physiologic insulin resistance, which is likely the latter, she doesn't tolerate carbohydrate very well. So, and I think that this is a function of her being on a ketogenic diet and forcing fatty acid oxidation. And then which drives a peripheral insulin resistance. And then also her pancreatic production of insulin, because she doesn't eat carbohydrates on a consistent basis, this is going to be altered. So yeah, when you are on a diet like this, you're doing keto, you're fasting, you're forcing fat oxidation, you don't have carbohydrate exposure. What's going to happen when you start eating carbs is you're going to have a rapid rise in your blood glucose levels, and it's going to take longer time to actually clear that blood glucose. So I think this is basically, if she continued to eat carbs over time, assuming she's not type 2 diabetic and there's not dysfunction in her ability to process carbohydrate as an energy substrate or problems with her pancreas, then essentially I think she would be able to not see this happen long term. So I think she doesn't fully understand the mechanisms in terms of what's going on that drives metabolic dysfunction, or how running high fat diet and oxidizing fats can actually drive insulin resistance. But this is a clear example of this. I also think it's weird that she tried to pick her one specific example, like her N=1 experiment on one-time consumption of grapes, to use it as a resource or a citation for that grapes are evil. So that's my first take there on the overarching context. Now, then she goes in to make some very specific points that I think these are also pretty strong exaggerations and an indication of a lack of understanding of the underlying physiology. So the first one she talks about is that her high blood glucose level will drive tau protein formation. So just for context for listeners, tau proteins are involved, or are said to be involved in the pathology of Alzheimer's disease. So basically you get an accumulation of amyloid beta and tau proteins, which impair neuronal function and neuronal energy metabolism. And so the accumulation of these is a hallmark of this. Now, inside the research, what you typically see is an association with states like type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance, obesity, and overarching metabolic dysfunction as a driver of tau accumulation and also amyloid beta accumulation. So Dr. Boz is assuming that if her blood glucose goes high one time, that she's forming tau proteins. But it's pretty clear from the literature that the problem in these states is an impaired ability to use carbohydrate. It's not necessarily that carbohydrate or glucose itself directly drives tau protein formation or amyloid beta protein formation. What more happens is that when the brain is having energetic failure or metabolic dysfunction, you have a hyperaccumulation of these proteins over time with a lack of breakdown, and then that is the pathology in and of itself. And so there's actually animal models that they take rats or mice and they humanize them so that they have similar pathology to Alzheimer's disease with tau accumulation. There's multiple models. Some are amyloid beta, some are tau accumulation. And what they actually find is that if they block glucose metabolism in these animals by giving them 2-deoxyglucose, which is an analog of glucose that cannot be metabolized effectively, they actually find it worsens tau accumulation, which is indicating actually that the problem is not that you are having glucose, it's that you are not taking glucose and effectively metabolizing it, which is, again, this is central to the pro-metabolic argument and the pro-metabolic perspective, that the problem is not glucose as a substrate. The problem is the inability to effectively oxidize glucose in through the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain to produce energy. And a lot of these disease states, almost all of these disease states have this as a characteristic central piece, particularly the long-term chronic health states in different metabolic diseases, which Alzheimer's and dementia are basically an offshoot of that, or a leg of that process. So, that kind of this idea that if you have a glucose spike that you're just driving tau protein formation, I don't think is 100% correct. I think it's an exaggeration, extrapolation that isn't borne out necessarily in the research. So there's this, and then the last piece that she goes into is she talks about, she says that glucose will be converted into fructose, and then the fructose will then be stored as fat. This is actually physiologically incorrect. So if we look at the fate of glucose, most ingested glucose is actually directly converted to energy through oxidation or non-oxidative pathways. So the oxidative pathway is running through Krebs cycle and an electron transport chain. Non-oxidative pathway is running through glycolysis. And then the other portion of that is stored as glycogen. So the vast majority of glucose is not converted into fructose. Now, some glucose can be converted into fructose. And this you tend to see again in pathologic states where glucose isn't being used effectively. You get a backlog of glucose through the glycolytic pathway, and then it gets shunted towards the polyol pathway where it gets converted to fructose. Now, one thing that is important to mention here is that if you are insulin sensitive, and when you consume carbohydrates and the cells effectively respond to insulin, the normal conversion of glucose to fructose is heavily curtailed. It's minimized to a very large extent because glucose upregulates all of the major enzymes through the glycolytic pathway that drive insulin upregulates all the enzymes in the glycolytic pathway that drive glucose into pyruvate to move it into the Krebs cycle. So it's in states of metabolic dysfunction with an impaired ability to respond to insulin because of issues inside the cell and inside the mitochondria and inside the insulin signaling cascade, that you then see a backlog towards the polyol pathway with conversion of fructose. Not necessarily just you have glucose, you eat it, and it gets converted to fructose, and then fructose just gets converted to fat. Not to mention that fructose doesn't just get converted to fat. And Jay and I have covered this in other podcasts where the vast majority of fructose doesn't actually wind up in de novo lipogenesis, which is the production of fat from carbohydrates. It winds up going either conversion to lactate, energy, back to glucose, or to glycogen. So it's just like basically this short indicates, at least to me, that Dr. Boz doesn't fundamentally understand the different metabolic pathways and understand what's going on in the states of insulin resistance. It's just kind of a fear-mongering post that tries to say that if you have glucose, if you eat glucose, you get tau protein formation, which creates cognitive dysfunction, or it converts to fructose, which then creates fat storage. And that's not really how things work when you start to get into the weeds of the physiologic pathways.
Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting, too, that she didn't mention that after being in the sauna, something in her was craving sugar. Like if she's on a ketogenic, sardine-based diet, but she's at the store and, something wisely in her body is saying, please get some grapes. And like you were saying, Mike, then she takes this one experience and extrapolates to why it's so dangerous. It kind of ignoring what deeper dysfunction is going on in her body and, the stress state she was likely in leaving the sauna. I'm guessing like incredibly low blood sugar, high stress hormones, and just kind of that ravenous state where the body is desperate for some kind of stability. Jay, what would you like to add to her scary video?
Yeah, I mean, I think you guys both touched on, again, just this overarching hyperbole, right? This extreme exaggeration, and then a lot of fear mongering with it. And I want to go back through and continue to break down some of the specifics there, like Mike did with some of those mechanisms, and mention a couple other points. But in a broad sense, this is not what we need in the health world, like in the online health space. We don't need more of this on social media. Like, this isn't helping anybody. This isn't helping us get closer to truth. It's not actually helping people improve their health in any way, obviously. And even if we thought that grapes weren't an ideal food, this is still, I think, just everything wrong with social media nowadays. And just adds to the division, the tribalism, just everything that we don't need right now any further. Causes people to have like this, intense fear when they're doing things. And obviously she ate the grapes. So I don't even know if she fully believes what she's saying here. Like, does she actually think that she's causing like permanent damage that she's not going to recover from, and she just thought that was worth it for this post? Or is she exaggerating further than what she knows is the truth, considering that she ate the grapes herself? And I don't think this is the only video where she's like showed her CGM and that, she's had glucose spikes and showing this obvious insulin resistance. So, and it reminds me a lot of Glucose Goddess, and we've talked about her a couple times and there's a number of people who do this where they show their glucose responses to foods and say, hey, I had a glucose spike to this that's higher than optimal, so don't eat it. And we've talked about this before. It's like, just because you're insulin resistant or because you're dealing with some issue doesn't mean that this food is a problem for everybody. And obviously there's so much more that goes into it. And there's a lot of issues with just looking at a CGM and saying, I had a spike, so don't eat this anymore, or this was bad. And that adds to all of this fear. And that adds to stress in a way that I don't think is productive for virtually anybody. So wanted to kind of start there. If you're dealing with low energy symptoms like chronic cravings and hunger, low energy and fatigue, joint pain, weight gain, digestive symptoms like bloating or issues with motility, brain fog, poor sleep or insomnia, hormonal imbalances, or various low energy chronic health conditions like autoimmune conditions, high blood pressure, insulin resistance, and on from there, then head over to jfeldmanwellness.com/energy, where you can sign up for the free Energy Balance mini course. In this mini course, I'll walk you through the best diet, exercise, and lifestyle strategies to resolve these low energy symptoms and chronic health issues. These strategies are all centered around how you can maximize your cellular energy to resolve these issues. So again, to sign up for that free Energy Balance mini course, head over to jfeldmanwellness.com/energy. But yeah, breaking down some of the claims she made and maybe kind of working backwards so it's fresher. Talking about, I think it was really ironic to talk about, and it shows, again, misunderstanding and I think just reductionism when it comes to these pathways. To talk about all this fear around the excess glucose being converted to fructose, which, as you said, Mike, is an extremely minor pathway unless there's major insulin resistance going on and major metabolic issues, but a super minor pathway, and not even mentioning the fructose that's already in the grapes. Like, you're getting way more fructose from the grapes than you're getting converted from glucose through the polyol pathway. And again, it's like, this pathway is bad. I heard Robert Lustig talk about it. And so that's the problem here. And again, just like no overarching conception of what's going on here. And then, of course, adding on to that, as you said, Mike, the fact that the fructose itself is not an issue. When we consume fructose, we utilize it incredibly well. We convert it to glycogen, we convert it to energy, we convert it to glucose and lactate to send out for the rest of the body to utilize, which, by the way, you're going to have way more fructose conversion to glucose than you ever would glucose to fructose. But all that aside, the amount that goes to de novo lipogenesis for fat production is extremely minimal, and also is far less than the amount of stored fat you would get from the amount of fat in the food that you ate, which in this case being ribs from the grocery store, I'm assuming are also really high in PUFA, if we're just talking about all of the potential problems with this meal. So I wanted to touch on that on the fructose side. As you mentioned, Mike, seeing this sort of glucose spike is just a sign of physiological insulin resistance. And speaking of the fear mongering here, I know so many people who are on low carb diets, and they've slowly made the transition toward utilizing carbs more, and they're feeling so much better and everything. But what they say is that early on, they had all this fear because they were using a CGM on their low carb ketogenic diet. And then they noticed anytime they ate something like fruit, they had this big spike, and it reinforced that that was bad for them and causing issues. And without explaining that that's a normal physiological response when your body hasn't consumed carbohydrates in a long time, changes the perception there. And that's, again, talking about the kind of hyperbole here. Missing that is adding to fear as opposed to just explaining the normal physiology. Because when you're on a ketogenic diet, and in her case, also a really low calorie diet, she had another post that maybe we'll do at some point talking about what she eats in a day, and it was nothing. It was like, a couple cans of sardines and some meat, and it was kind of it. But in any case, all of those things drive this physiological insulin resistance, which is an adaptive mechanism. Again, it's not pathologic, which is important to note, but also it's temporary. It's just because you're not consuming the carbs. And after a couple days of consuming more carbohydrates, you see this blood sugar response lessen. It doesn't go away, like it'll still be higher than optimal because it takes some time for kind of full adaptation of the mitochondrial enzymes and the hormones and everything. And digestion, I mean, there's so many factors that take a little bit of time to adapt, but it's a temporary normal response to a very low carb diet. It's not a pathological response. And it doesn't mean that grapes are causing high blood sugar in someone who's not in that state. And it doesn't mean that they're causing insulin resistance either. So yeah, just really important to highlight that, since that wasn't something that she discussed at all. And then we have this fear mongering about the blood sugar spike itself. And oftentimes we'll hear it in terms of glycation, or we'll hear it in terms of some sort of oxidative damage to the blood vessels or something like that. But here we're getting this fear around the tau protein and Alzheimer's. And Mike, you mentioned a couple of really important things here, which are that in like the states where we're seeing accumulated beta amyloid and tau proteins, reduced glucose utilization is a key feature. And another way of saying that is when your brain is using more glucose, there's more glucose uptake and more glucose metabolism, there's less tau protein and less amyloid beta accumulation. When there's less glucose uptake in the brain and less utilization, that's when you see more of those problems. And you actually see the pathology of Alzheimer's disease. So it's really the opposite of what's being suggested here, and definitely very far from the underlying state, which, what you do see in that pathology is poor glucose utilization, which then leads to reduced uptake and reduced utilization and low energy and the chronic issues with that. So we do want to make sure that we're not consuming, carbs without considering how we're utilizing them and supporting our energy production, supporting our mitochondria. Like, that's all important. But again, it's not the carbs that are the issue, as you touched on. And the other thing is, I think maybe where she's getting this from is there are some studies looking at acute hyperglycemia, so acute moments of high blood sugar, and they show increased amounts of amyloid beta in the interstitial fluid in the brain. And that might be misconstrued or misinterpreted as an increase in production of amyloid beta from hyperglycemia that she's saying is going to happen every minute that her blood sugar is elevated. But the reality in those cases is there's not actually an increase in total amount of amyloid beta. It's just being released from the neurons into the interstitial fluid where they're measuring the amount of amyloid beta. But they even note in some of those studies that when they look at the total amount, there's no increase. It's just a movement from one area to another. And so maybe there's some misinterpretation there. I haven't, looked at that much in the low carb space, if those are some studies that are being cited and that's where she got this from, like listening to someone who was citing that and saying that any moment that your blood sugar is too high is going to cause increased tau protein production or amyloid beta, but there's no evidence or physiological support for that. Again, not to say that having chronic spikes in the 200s is ideal, but that's so separated from what's actually going on here.